Today we are going to be looking at two Dutch defense games, one played by me on chess.com as a blitz game, the other a classical game played by two famous grandmasters, Alexander Kotov and Igor Bondarevsky. We're going to begin with the famous game first, of course. So it starts with d4, we get e6. There's many ways to play the Dutch. You can start with f5. The drawback of starting with f5 is that there is some gambit with e4 called the Staunton gambit, and it's a tricky line. If you're playing the Stonewall, you would kind of want a closed position. This would lead to an open position, so starting with e6 is good. Of course, if they start with e4, you would either have to go into the French or Owens, as I like doing, but luckily here we just get a normal Stonewall structure. So both sides develop. Black gets these pawns on f5, e6, d5. He's soon going to have a pawn on c6. And depending on how white develops, black's bishop will either go to d6 or to e7. So here the bishop comes to d6. If the bishop comes to f4, typically you can still go for the Stonewall structure, but a dark squared trade of bishops would only help white, because since your pawns are committed on the light squares, your light squared bishop is very bad, so you don't want to get rid of your only good bishop. That's why bishop d6 would be an inaccuracy, and you would need to play bishop e7 to retain it. There's people think the bishop on e7 is more passive, but there's actually ways to use it aggressively. For example, you do have a battery set up on g5, so jumping the knight to e4 and going g5 is an idea in the middle game, and that bishop on e7 makes it that much easier to play g5, and since the bishop is on f4, it will come with a tempo in the middle game, so that's a nice aspect of having the bishop on e7. In this game, however, the bishop was not yet committed to f4, so black just opts to go bishop d6. Now, white can still play bishop f4. This is a move you would get an exchange. Black argues that white's pawns are doubled and that is good for him. White's king is also open. However, it's not such a bad pawn structure for white, and that is why it's a line, and a popular line at that, actually. But we do get bishop d6. White plays c4. Very common stuff. The nice thing about the Dutch is it's so easy to play. The Stonewall Dutch is easy to play, I should say. The setup is very sturdy. It can be done against many different setups that white chooses, and that's why in my opinion it's one of the easiest openings to play, and it's also very aggressive. I also liked closed structures, which it is, because typically they get very complex when you blow open the position in the middle game or end game. Eventually the position will open up and it'll be a fun game, so I like the maneuvering battle that it constitutes with the locked structure. Knight d2, we get knight d2. Knight d2 is more common than knight c3, and the idea is actually to get a knight on f3 and d3, because of the pawn structure. e5 is a very weak square. It's a hole in the position, so black over controls e4 at the expense of e5. So white typically rotates this knight to d2, the other one to d3, and then they can get the knights defending each other on e5 in the center of the board. Similarly, since white cannot control e4, sometimes black goes knight e4, knight f6, and the knights are very strong in the center for both sides. We get castles and b3. Now, this is a very aggressive opening, even though it doesn't look so. Black wants to attack on the king side, and a good way to do that is shifting the queen over to e8. The reason this move was played is that specifically when they have the fianchetto here on the king side, hard to infiltrate with the queen on the dark squares, very easy to infiltrate with the queen on the light squares, and you can already see an attack brewing in the future. Once the queen gets to h5, this f pawn being on f5 can allow for a rook lift, and yeah, the h file can get very dangerous for white very quickly. So white goes knight e1. He is routing this knight over to d3 to kind of blockade the center. That's weak for us, so that would be good for white to do. Black develops the knight to d7. Now, I remember when I started playing the Dutch, I did not really include this knight d7 move, and even though I got a good attack going in the middle game sometimes, my rook ended up being too clogged on the queen side. So knight d7 is a move that you will thank yourself for later, because it allows you to get your rook into the game need be. You know, when you're attacking and you're like, oh, I wish I had one more piece to attack with. That's kind of how I view this move. Just one more attacker that can be brought into the game at a moment's notice, and that helps black out a lot. So now we get white just trying to clamp down on the center. Black is doing the same. It is ill-advised for white to take this knight. Black can usually take back on either direction. If he takes with the f pawn, well, if you take with either pawn, you gain a tempo on the knight. If you take with the f pawn, yes, you get the open rook. You also need to be aware that you do weaken the e6 pawn. You can also take with the d pawn, which is also very good. And like I said, you gain a tempo on the knight, and the way to make it so that these doubled pawns are not so weak is going to be to push e5, and in doing so you undouble your pawns. So that would be the way to deal with your central pawns. It's playable, but it is ill-advised for white to take the knight. Of course, if it's there for a long time, chess is so position specific. If something changes at a moment's notice, sometimes it'll be good for white to take. So always be cautious of, don't just blindly believe that knight is safe in the center. You always need to calculate. Chess is very position specific. White is going again for this e5 square, and black goes queen h5. Computer does call it a mistake. The point of queen h5 is if the knight comes to f4, which it actually does, you do not want to trade this knight for the bishop, because again, this is your only good bishop. And so black should retreat the queen. You can go back to e8, but then you're just improving the knight and putting your queen back on the starting square. So he goes to f7, just makes a little bit of progress. And then the nice thing about the nice thing for black about this knight being on f4 is that it blocks this bishop's diagonal to g5. So for example, white played queen c2, a developing move, and now that this knight is on f4, white only has one defender on g5 rather than two. We also have one defender on g5, and that is what allows us to then play g5. So black kind of gave up a tempo to gain a tempo, because now the knight needs to go back, and then the queen is able to go back to h5. Gave up a tempo to get back a tempo, and now he has two defenders on g5, and his queen is where he wanted it to be, which is on the h file. So I like the idea by black. Computer did not approve, but computer never approves. So now we get knight e5. We've talked a lot about that move, and rook f6. This is my favorite part of the Dutch, this rook lift. So with this pawn on f5, makes it very easy to rotate the rook over to the h file. And the nice thing about this pawn on g5 is it cuts the bishop off from guarding h6, so it makes it easier to rotate and start a kingside attack. Now you might be saying, this knight does not have a lot of retreating squares, and it doesn't have any retreating squares. But after we get f3, typically this is not a great move for white. In fact, if this knight is not here, if you can imagine this knight not here, and f3 is played, there's some sacrifice ideas with knight takes g3, h takes g3, and bishop takes g3. Then you kind of put white in a mating box. In the future, we can look at games where that has happened, and it's very dangerous for white to deal with. Now, against f3, you do not want to take the pawn and then go rook h6, because then, in essence, he's gaining a tempo. You want to go rook h6 right away. And now, if this f-pawn were to take the knight, this did not happen in the game, but had it happened, the queen comes in to h2, the king would then come to f2. There's two very nice moves here for black. Keep in mind, this bishop is pinned, so a nice move would be rook h3, and it's very hard to guard against queen takes g3, and black has a lot of counterplay for the piece. The other possible move would be knight to f6, and the point of knight f6 is it's exploiting the bishop in a different way. Knight f6 is the better of the two, and the reason being is you're bringing an extra piece into the attack, and knights are great for attacking, especially when your opponent's pieces are tied down. So you're threatening knight takes e4 now. They would have to play like rook g1 because their king is about to be forced to move and they wouldn't want to lose the bishop, so they want to guard the bishop. This would allow the knight to then come in, okay, apparently there's better, f takes e4, but one example is the knight coming in, king goes back, knight takes pawn. You have 3 pawns for the knight, and this is not a fun position at all for white to play. It's very scary. In the game, we did not get that. We got pawn to h4, and this weakens g3. So it stops the immediate attack, but it does weaken g3. and black immediately jumped on that. So he won a pawn, he's attacking the rook, and now white takes this pawn, attacking the rook. The rook looks trapped. It is not. We will discuss why. He should have taken the pawn with the bishop and done it this way to numb the attack on the h-file. Taking with the h-pawn opens up the h-file and allows the queen to then come in, and this allows the rook space to move now. King f2 is forced, and here rook to h3 is not as good in the previous variation because now the knight is blockading the g3 square. So in essence, all you're doing is clogging up the pieces on your attack. They're not actually so coordinated. So yes, you're exploiting a pin, but not really to gain anything. It's kind of just a move you could play, but not a move you should play. So instead, rook to h4 was played. This is a beautiful move. Black recognizes that d4 is a pin holding white's position together. You can think about it, if you remove this d pawn, you're opening up a whole new diagonal for weaknesses around white's king. So rook to d4, a very nice move, threatening d4. This rook is still under attack. White opts to save the rook and then loses the pin that was holding his position together. Losing the d4 pawn destabilizes these centralized knights as well, and now it is getting even harder for whites to play this position. Bishop to b2 attacks the rook, and you would think the rook should move. There's many things to do here. Engine likes knight takes e5 because it looks like you get two pieces for the rook, and this would just be devastating for white to deal with. Yeah, white's whole position is collapsing. If they block, you could just take the other rook. That is GG's right there. So what black ended up doing here is gone queen h4. Now again, mistake. Computer is just being rude. This sets up a big discovered attack on the king. Now the bishop should take and did take the rook, and here you could do two things. You can go knight e4 check, double check, or you could take the bishop. He tried to go knight e4 check, sorry, and had white gone king f1, the position would then have to repeat, and black would then take the bishop. Not an easy position at all for white to play. Just to show you how easy it is to go wrong, say king takes g3 was played, and you would then get this exchange. All of a sudden, white is going to get checkmated because after queen to f4, there's no way to stop the impending mates. So had white's king gone to f1, we would have gotten a repeat, and this queen takes bishop. But white got greedy. He went king to e3. And yes, this looks like the wrong move, but black has to prove it, and there's only one way to prove it. Now we get one of my favorite mates of all time. This knight is containing the king on e3. There's just a massive blockade around the king, and everything is trapped in for white. So black correctly calculates and plays f4. The reason f4 is played is to deflect the knight. The knight is forced to take because the king cannot move. So the knight gets deflected away from f2, that is, allowing the queen to then come into f2. After king to d3, we get a beautiful queen sacrifice. Queen takes bishop, bringing the king into the center of the board. It's not often that you see a grandmaster's king on d4. Very amazing game by black. Now, okay, if you take this knight with the bishop here, the king then gets to e3 and might find safety. So it actually makes more sense to go bishop to c5 check, and white resigned here, but we'll talk about why. This cuts off e3, the king is on d4 in check, the knight is covering c3, so the king has to go back to d3. And now, amazing enough, I wish white would have let the game play out to the checkmate and not resigned to move earlier, because it's just a beautiful mate. Knight covers d2 c3, bishop covers e3 d4, and this knight on e5 is checkmating white. You almost never see checkmates like this at the grandmaster level, and this was my favorite Dutch game of all time, and still is my favorite Dutch game of all time. So this brings us to the next game we're going to look at, which is a game I had today, and it reminded me of that game. That's what made me think of this video. I was like, that was similar to my favorite Dutch game of all time, so I got really lucky to be able to have a game like that today. And it started out with knight f3. So knight f3 is such a flexible move, and I don't have a direct response to it, so I kind of just play whatever I'm feeling like. Today I was feeling like playing the Dutch, so I did. I believe the ready, which is knight f3, I believe the best way to play against the Dutch is to play a King's Indian attack, because you're putting the pawn on d3, and then you're going to fight to play e4 after you castle and kind of destabilize black, because the point of the Dutch is to not allow white to play e4. So if they play the King's Indian attack, they're playing to play e4. So it's kind of, in my mind, it's a direct counter to the Dutch, but he did not do that. He just played it into a Queen's Gambit, and we got a Dutch defense. Now, what I said, the Dutch is very easy to play. That doesn't mean there's not intricacies. Like, for example, I know b3 is a move, and the point of b3 is that if you're not careful, if you just castle and blindly just play the position like a normal Dutch, you're going to get hit with bishop to a3. And what this does is it forces off a dark squared bishop trade. And remember, you don't want the dark squared bishop trade like we talked about at the beginning, because this is black's only good bishop. So when that is removed, he's left with this light squared bishop, which is actually pretty garbage because it's stuck behind a light squared pawn structure, a locked pawn structure. So black wants to avoid this trade, and the way I found out about this was actually by a Magnus game. So the Stonewall Dutch is not played very often nowadays. Magnus can play absolutely anything and still beat everybody. So he played a Dutch game, and he faced this b3 move, and he played queen e7, and it actually made a lot of sense. The point was to stop bishop to a3, and you know, if this knight moves, then you're not worried about bishop to a3, and you could just then play queen e8, queen h5. It's a locked structure, so tempos matter less than in an open position, so you could get away with stuff like that. If, though, white played a4 and he's like, nope, we are trading this bishop, I'm making sure of it, he did it at the cost of weakening b4. So, like, for example, b4 is an outpost for black for the rest of the game, either to plop a knight there or a bishop, we shall see. If they play bishop a3, you could even play bishop b4, and on this exchange, well, okay, so if white didn't exchange, you might even be able to get a knight there. But if white does exchange, this is actually a beautiful pawn, stagnating white structure, stopping this knight from coming to a3 or c3. And this is just a long term, it's a great pawn to have for black to keep applying pressure. So it's like a trade-off. If white plays b3 with the knight still on b1, you just have to be aware of this queen e7 move. This did not happen in the game. We get knight d2. A different move order than the first game, but I think the same exact position. So castles, b3, queen e8. Yes, he got a dubious in his game, I got a dubious in my game, but it is an attacking idea in the Dutch. And now we get bishop b2. See, they cannot go bishop a3 because of the way they develop their knight immediately. Now knight d7. Again, I used to run into problems by not playing this move, so now I do play this move, and I guess I run into less problems. I don't play the Dutch that often. I'm so happy I played it this morning because I got this game, and it was my best Dutch game ever, so glad I played it. Knight to e5, knight to e4, and knight to f3. See, very solid knights in the center. We've talked about how I gave up e5. They cannot take control of e4, so it's natural that these knights would come to these great squares. Now I played g5, and I am deemed a mistake for that, but I'm fine with that. Computer is rude. So g5, common attacking idea in the Dutch. Now he goes knight back, a little bit of a slow move in my opinion, and then I get my queen to h5. He then brings his other knight over to e5, and I could tell he's trying to play f3, and I was like, wait, I've seen attacking ideas like this before. So I knew to play rook f6 right away, get to the h file, he plays f3, and I go rook h6. Now, it's very similar to the other game. He, however, did take my knight, queen takes h2, king f2, and again, there is many moves here I can take and try to pressure him on the f file. I can go rook h3. I decided to go knight f6. I don't care about the judgment of that move. Still a good move. So knight to f6, same idea, trying to exploit the pin, trying to get to e4. Very, it's a position that kind of plays itself, and that's what I like about the Dutch. So many people don't like the Dutch because of how weird the positions get. They're kind of just very obscure positions, but those are my type of positions, and good, if you like positions where they're very confusing and you believe whoever calculates better will win, those are the positions I love. If you love those positions, then I do recommend the Dutch. He does go rook g1, protecting the bishop, kind of the same idea, allowing the king to go to f1 and not losing this bishop to this knight e4 check if it has to go away. Still, of course, I'm going to take on e4, and he goes king to e3. Had he gone there, I would take, repeat, and I would have a few pawns for the piece and play on in this position. However, he went king to e3, a blunder. Queen takes g3. You can see it's kind of similar. The king is trapped on e3, so we get bishop to f3. Now I want to not only deflect the knight, I want to win a piece, to be honest. So I push the pawn. His knight has to take. I do not want to take here, because then after the king moves to d3, I will be pinned and I might lose a queen there. So of course, take with the queen. King has one square to move to, and then knight to f2. So I did not get a beautiful mate in the center of the board, but I did get a beautiful knight fork that caused him to resign. And this was my favorite Dutch game ever, or that I've played. My favorite Dutch game ever is still the famous one. That is way better because it's a classical game. This is just a blitz game. But yeah, I kind of found it amazing the similarities between the two. Now, if you guys enjoyed this video, and if you think you like the Dutch defense and would like me to make opening videos about the Dutch, I can do that. It is a very fun opening and I would enjoy it. So hope you enjoyed and have a great day. Thank you.